right, I think we'll begin tonight. We have a small audience live. Maybe economics scares people. That might be it. But I know we have some people who have come specifically for the topic, so this is great. It is our final topic in the series. This is our 6th month, and we have just 2 more evenings after this. So it's bittersweet. Let me remind all online and here that it's made possible through both funding and work by a number of organizations and individuals. Funders include the Michigan Humanities and the Michigan Council for Arts and Cultural Affairs. It's produced by a team. Kathy Organ is sitting in front of me. Thomas Trehe is at the back at the technology. Kathy Calabretta is online, and Mike McKinney and Matt Sanderson have not been able to attend the series, but they helped put it together. And also I'm part of the team as well. I'm Brooke Portman. So I also want to thank Eric Smith, who is the director of the Mason County District Library, for his support, administrative, moral, and financial. Can't get any better than that. And I also want to thank Sue Carlson, who does our press releases, and Lisa Daines for keeping the website up to date. Mind and body are both needed for learning, and so here live we have coffee, macaroons tonight dipped in chocolate, as well as some delicious chocolate chip cookies with all kinds of things in them. I hope those at home are giving themselves a little dinner treat or beverage or dessert or something or other. 2 tech notes. We may have a problem with the connection, oddly enough, not online and not with the speaker, but here in the room, our connection, we sometimes lose it. We lose it in more ways than one, I suppose, but we'll kind of pass that right along. So we may go out for 10 to 30 seconds here. The folks online and our presenter will not know that we've gone away until Thomas comes back in and says, whoops, excuse me, we lost the last 10 to 30 seconds of content. So we will need to step back and then keep going forward. The other piece, other tech note is, because we are online and live, we need to have all questions mic'd. So during the Q&A, I will read all the chat questions, and Nathan will mic our lovely voices here in the audience for questions. Also, please note the poem that's in tonight's packet. We are talking about difficult things, difficult lives of children as we talk about childhood poverty. This is a poem, a beautiful poem, a grandfather's poem, about his 5-year-old granddaughter and his blessings and wishes for her as she becomes of age. It's a beautiful poem. So please enjoy it, and children of wealth and of no wealth can also enjoy it. So I begin this topic, my little introduction here of the topic, with a personal note. And that is, I was the one who selected economics. Gosh knows why, but it is because during the last 3 or 4 years, and I have to say I'm not quite sure when, because of the pandemic, maybe it was 3 years ago, maybe it was 5 years ago, but somewhere in there, I read a review of a new book out in economics, and the reviewer gave it a review that fascinated me, that interested me, that I said, well, maybe I can learn something about economics. I'd been closed off to it. And his final, I think, part of the review that sent me to read it was that he said that the economist, Mariana Mazzucato, who is a European, had been an advisor to people here in the United States, congressional leaders on both sides of the fence. So that's what started me in. That book and others by, I will say, that generation, and people thinking along those lines, which isn't necessarily new. They stand on the shoulders of lots of people in the early 20th century and forward, and perhaps even backwards the other way. But about bringing ethics into the room when people talk economics. Up to that point, I'd been shut out because I raised questions that I was told, you're being sentimental, you're way too much of a humanist, Brooke, and any other kind of thing that just said, you don't know what economics is really all about. So I had plenty of other things I was interested in, so I said, okay, this changed me. I don't know to what degree it's anywhere influencing, let's say, anything that we do here tonight or that I did in sort of trying to set this together in motion, but it has changed my life. And I can only wish for other people, if you're not into economics, to find a way in, because it's a very valuable topic and something that everyone gets to sit at the table and should sit at the table. So the other thing I need to say about this series is that this topic is we will focus really on government in this, because we have no problem connecting business with economics in this country. We have a problem with connecting anything good about government with being active. And there are ways in which the government has been and needs to be active in economics for the whole mixed economy to work. So that's why we're focusing on trying to unlearn some negative things that we've learned possibly and to keep moving forward. So here's how the series will go, these three sessions. Tonight, the first session is we're going to hear how government might be in the future. We're actually starting with the future. And on a very specific, limited problem, childhood poverty. In the second session, we'll look at the phrase good enough for government. I always heard that as a derogatory term. Do you know it started as an honorific term? If your work was good, if your performance on a job was good, that would qualify, good enough that it would qualify for government work, it was outstanding work. So we'll look at how we lost that and why, and what harm does it do to us if we do that. And Amy Lerman from California, University of Berkeley, or University of California at Berkeley will be our presenter then. She's a political scientist who also is very interested in public opinion and how it shapes what we do. In the third and final session, we'll look at government's role itself in the Second World War effort and the post-recovery. So government was a hugely important player in this, and this was, without government, we would not have become the industrialized, prosperous, powerful nation that we did, and we kind of lost that vision. So that will be our focus for these next three sessions. Tonight, childhood poverty. If you're not quite sure or can't quite remember what is the level of poverty here, let me just briefly tell you that, and then I'll introduce our speaker. In Ludington, 50 to 64% of the elementary children are eligible for free and reduced lunch. 44% of middle school children are eligible. High school students are broken down into three categories. Interestingly enough, STEM students, ones that all high schools sort of want their students to be, STEM students, some of the brightest, but not all, but some of them, 22% are eligible. It goes up considerably with the general student body to 37%. And if a child has disabilities, that percentage of students goes up to 72%. That are eligible for free and reduced lunch. In our state, 38% of Michigan families are below the poverty line. So let me give you an example. And this includes, some may know about ALICE, which is about, it's an assisted living. It's above federal poverty level. It still isn't enough to have a life. Bare bones life, bare bones household economics, as they say. So for a family of two, that poverty line below $23,000. For a family of four, the line that puts you so to speak, outside the poverty line is $36,000. So imagine feeding, clothing, hospitalizing, just normal shots, et cetera, for children, much less a vacation, much less any treats. Anyway, we'll now turn to our speaker tonight, Jeff Madrick. Jeff is an economic researcher and journalist. We'll see Jeff soon. He graduated, there he is. He graduated from New York and Harvard universities. His career includes 7 books, including the book we're discussing tonight, or the contents of it anyway, is Invisible Americans, The Tragic Cost of Child Poverty. His research has also appeared in the New York Times, Harper's Magazine, New York Review of Books, The Washington Post, the LA Times, Institutional Investor, The Nation, and American Prospect, among others. He also has been online. His teaching and research includes visiting professor with the Cooper Union in New York. He is the director of the Bernard Schwartz Rediscovering Government Initiative at the New School for Social Research in New York. He's a senior fellow at the Century Foundation. He has advised U.S. congressional legislators. Please help me welcome Jeff Madrick.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for attending. Thank you, Brooke. I actually know Mariana and reviewed her book at length. I think her first serious book for the New York Review of Books. Her central theme is belief in government. And so we had a lot in common, and apparently she has some thinking in common with Brooke, and she has had significant influence. She's a rebel in the economics profession because the economics profession often neglects government. And in fact, until the last 3 or 4 years, it seemed to me almost entirely neglected government in a serious way. And that includes many Democrats, not just the Republicans. So congratulations that you found Mariana, and she had such influence on you. She works out of London and has developed an institute there that's been quite successful, I think. But I want to talk about poverty and why I've written about a lot of things, particularly economic growth, which is how we develop a middle class and become more, all of us, I'm going to talk about how all of us don't, but how many of us became prosperous in the post-World War II period. The main point I have to make, and what bothers me so much about America, is not merely the neglect of government, the faith in government, the belief in government that's occupied us from 1980 and started to become a real problem in the 1970s. Milton Friedman was the main bad influence in the 70s, and it got worse as we went along. And even Democrats supported Friedman. Friedman wasn't always wrong. He wasn't an unintelligent man, needless to say, but he very much believed in free markets and the Adam Smith invisible hand, more so than Adam Smith did. And it's led us down. Just one number to give you an idea, the path we've come down since Friedman and Ronald Reagan became influential. Ronald Reagan's period in office, basically the 1980s, was not a greatly prosperous period, contrary to what people say. It's extraordinary to me that some people keep thinking it was. There were some boom years after deep recessions, but by and large, on average, economic growth was pretty average, to repeat the word. It didn't set anything on fire except tax cuts got a lot of people rich. It was the beginning of a huge billionaire class. What's happened since the billionaires have grown in numbers, in extraordinary numbers, since 1990, basically the end of the Reagan administration, is that economic growth has not done well at all. Between 1950 and 1980, until Reagan, economic growth was on average 2.25% in America. That is to say, per capita incomes per person in America grew at 2.5% a year. That's darn good over time. That 2.5% compounds rapidly. Since 1990, with the rise of the billionaire class, the growth rate in America has been 1 to 1.2% a year. That's pretty significant. People who say that if we produce rich people, there will be a trickle down to the middle and the lower middle class and the poor. It's not true. Economic growth suffered with the rise of the billionaire class. Now, I'm not really here to talk about this. I'm here to talk about what made me very angry. I've always been angry about the economy and mainstream economics. And in fact, I wrote a book called 7 Bad Ideas, published by Alfred Knopf a few years ago, on what damage mainstream economics has done. But what particularly bothered me was child poverty in America, so neglected by a rich country that by and large, we had the lowest child poverty rate, with 1 or 2 exceptions, of any rich nation in the world. Imagine that. Imagine talking about America being decent with a child poverty rate like that. Now, I've been interested in poverty, I think, since I was doing economics. I studied economics. I wrote about it, as Brooke mentioned, but nothing bothered me as much as poverty in America. It's a complex subject. Even defining poverty is complex, and I don't think people realize it. When they say this proportion of people are above the poverty line, people treat that as a meaningful number. In fact, it's not a meaningful number. It's a highly ambiguous number, and that has to be recognized. Why do Americans do not have the social policies that Western Europe and some other major democracies have to deal with poverty? Why the heck is that? Somehow we believe that the poor create their own poverty. The poor are to blame. Okay, let's say that's true, and it's not, by the way, but let's say that's true. Why do we allow children to remain poor? Certainly we can't blame children for their own poverty. And that's what began to get me incensed about the American economy and the American social attitudes. And again, let me say, we're not just dealing with Republicans here. We're also dealing with Democrats. Why didn't getting rid of child poverty, literally getting rid of it, rise to a priority? I'll return to this subject, but why do we blame children, even inadvertently, for their own poverty? And why do we not recognize fully the consequences for children growing up poor? A lot of people, in fact, think there aren't consequences. The real consequences, they think, are a culture of poverty, often associated with African Americans, shirking work, learning how not to work, learning how to game the system. It's just not true, and it got me pretty aggravated. So 5 or 6 years ago, at my think tank, which is part of the Century Foundation, we began to do programs on child poverty, and in fact, did some panel discussions. We contracted researchers at the Columbia School of Social Work, economists there, who do very good work and look deeply into poverty and were interested in child poverty. And we asked them to determine how beneficial it would be just to give poor families cash, enough cash to raise the standard of living of their kids, enough cash to reduce the stress in the life of the family, to enable them to buy nutritious, not merely nutritious food, but nutritious, create a nutritious learning environment of calm, and enable their kids to go to better schools, live in better environments, live in environments that were not polluted. why we decided we have to start emphasizing that. And I think it was 2015. I did an op-ed piece. I used to write a column for the New York Times, and I did an op-ed piece stating just this, and how we had to give poor families literally cash, not just welfare, not earned income tax credits based on how much money they make, but outright cash. The Times was bombarded by angry people who say, you're just giving money away to people who will waste it. They probably waste it on themselves, not on their kids. So I kept pursuing this. It turns out there's a lot of documented evidence that where there are cash allowances in the world, the parents spend it on the kids, and often nutritiously, that is, often constructively. So we kept going. We decided to contract a paper from Columbia to find out whether cash benefits are more beneficial than income tax credits, that is, reducing your taxes by how much money you pay. The surprising result was that cash allowances were much more efficient. You got a bigger bang for your buck from those cash allowances. Now, here's the irony, and one of the leaders of the Columbia group told me this recently. They said when Jeff Madrick came up with this idea that we should explore cash allowances, they thought I was crazy. But let's do it because he's paying us TK 1,000 to do this study. What the heck? We'll see what happens. What happens is the cash allowance worked very well, and they were very surprised, and they were very thankful that they did it. Why did they think I was off my rocker? Because nobody was interested in cash allowances for kids to any significant degree. They were only interested at most in an income tax credit. And I wanted to change that, and so did my cohorts at Century Foundation, and so did a few other people in the community. That all changed rapidly in the following 6 years to 2021 and 2022. The academic community climbed aboard wholeheartedly the idea of cash allowances. That is, giving money to the parents of poor kids every month, could be a different time period, to enable them to take care of these kids and create a positive environment for them. Why did it take so long? Well, some of them believed in something like that. And most of them who joined this pack believed that child poverty was a serious problem, but they hadn't thought it was in any way practical that America would decide to give cash allowances to families without strings, without demands that they get to send their kids to the dentist or buy them books. They'd allow the parents to do the parenting, to make decisions on how to use this money best for the kids. That's a big deal, actually, and it wasn't something I was going to cover in this little talk. But the patronizing attitude that we have to tell parents how to raise their kids in order to qualify for money, I think has finally left the public discussion, or at least the serious public discussion. Though lots of people believed it then, and many still believe it now. Indeed, many people are opposed to cash allowances that we finally got passed by Congress and has since been obviated until hopefully new legislation will come around. People like Senator Manchin believe parents will just waste this money on themselves. He said it recently. What a guy. Did he look at any research? Almost all major democracies, especially if they are wealthy democracies, give child allowances in cash without consequence, without telling parents how to raise their kids. They give these unconditional allowances to the families. Research has been done on this subject, therefore, and it's found, in fact, a couple of the Columbia researchers did the best work, It's found that parents surprisingly don't spend it on booze for themselves or drugs or some new clothing and so forth. They spend it constructively on their children. So why don't people like Manchin look at this information? And American researchers started looking into it as well. Why don't they look on it? They don't want to believe it. Or they believe the researchers are fibbing because they're just bleeding heart liberals. You can probably tell I'm pretty angry at this. So we went out and publicized as much as we could about the real facts of the matter. And that's why I wrote my book, Invisible Americans, which includes the research on these kinds of subjects. But let me go right to the beginning. The beginning is kids pay a very big price for being poor. They suffer pain. They're often in pain because their health is bad. Consider the common earache, the toothache, but consider other even worse maladies. They know they are poor. They suffer shame. And I really want to emphasize this. If I want to emphasize anything in this talk, it's that. Kids know they're poor. Their poverty is not their fault, and they suffer pain. It is painful to be poor as a child. The real problem going forward is their cognitive and emotional development is stunted. There is no ambiguity about this anymore. Low levels of income in the family. I just don't mean bad upbringing. I mean low levels of income create reductions in cognitive abilities and emotional immaturity. Now, how do we know this? Many people say it's not income, it's not money. Money doesn't matter as much as you're saying it does, Jeff Madrick. It's bad upbringing, maybe it's the neighborhood, maybe it's the bad school. Researchers are attentive to this issue. And let me just get some, let me tell you how we determined that money mattered so much. There are a bunch of studies, and if I can find the pages, I'm looking in my own book, so if any of you have the book, I urge you to look at some of this. Let me tell you some studies that were so suggestive of why money matters so much. First of all, there are natural experiments. Natural experiments are those that are not planned, they're not created, they occur by accident, so to speak. One of the biggest ones was when the earned income tax credit was expanded for families with children in 1993. Researchers looked at those families that got more money, and it turned out that those who got more money for their kids produced kids who finished school, were emotionally more stable, and were healthier. It was an unambiguous result. The American Indian casino is another example of how money helped kids improve their outcomes. The Eastern Band of Cherokees, I don't know the difference between the Eastern and the Western Band, but they were allowed to put up a casino in 1996 and use the revenues for their own purposes. They decided they would give casino profits every 6 months to the families who had children. The children's money were placed in a bank account until they were 18. The contribution the first year averaged $4,000. But by 2006, several studies of the consequences were complete. The annual contribution per person had reached $9,000. The payments improved educational achievement significantly for the average family in these compared to non-Indian families in the same region. The proportion of who graduated high school increased substantially. The amount of crime committed by kids was reduced substantially. One study found that psychiatric disorders in adolescence and well into young children, adulthood were significantly lower. That's a pretty compelling study. So is the EITC. There are a bunch of others, all of these done in the last 10 to 15 years. Canada in particular has had a generous child allowance program in a town called Dauphin in Manitoba. They were guaranteed incomes equivalent to, let me just get down to the, cognitive success was significant, measured by achievement exams and school attainment levels. Mental and emotional health were measured in a number of ways. Canada now leads, certainly our hemisphere, but leads Western nations in providing significant benefits. Then the London School, I shouldn't keep going on, but I just found this fascinating. So let me just do a couple more. The London School of Economics, the main idea in developing these studies is to isolate the effects of income alone from other possible causes of improvement in the kids, like better education, like better parenting. At least the LSE study, the London School of Economics, carefully isolated the effect of money on kids' outcomes from the rest of possible causes. They found an extraordinary relationship. They found something like 35 studies that showed that money alone mattered significantly to kids' outcomes. One or two more, well, maybe just one more. A long-term study of mothers' pensions in America showed in the early 1900s, showed that when the mothers got pensions from the government, the outcomes for their kids was significantly improved. Over time, a summary of the outcomes published in 2016 found children lived 1 year longer than the children of mothers who did not receive these benefits. Now, a year in a large group is a long time. The number of underweight infants in the pension groups was reduced sharply. Children attended school longer, and they were much less likely to drop out of high school, therefore earning higher wages. The upshot is, the significance of this, let me repeat if I haven't made it clear already, is that money seriously matters to kids and the poor and their future outcomes. The evidence is virtually unambiguous, and yet people resist the idea. Indeed, for much of the 1980s, people believed welfare was the problem, not the solution. Welfare created dependency. Some of you may remember those days. I think many of you do, actually. And that was by and large the end of welfare as we knew it from the Johnson years. I want to go back to something about the much maligned LBJ. The War on Poverty, which was the LBJ program, as you know, was quite successful. Now that may surprise many of you because he's been so maligned. He wasn't maligned in this regard by Robert Caro, who took him on in some other matters. But what happened in the study of poverty is that in the Great Depression, many, if not most people, were we would call poor. FDR said at least 1/3 of Americans are poor. I'm not talking about children, I'm talking about all Americans. He understated it, surely. So we get out of the Depression largely through World War II, and the economy took off in the 1950s, as I mentioned already. What happened? People climbed out of poverty due to the economy. Yes, capitalism worked in the 1950s. It worked, even though Eisenhower was not a great social policy advocate. But then by the 1960s, it was clear to JFK's chief economist, Walter Heller, that poverty wasn't falling as rapidly as it should have been, given the rapid growth of the middle class in America. And he wanted to explore why. JFK was upset by this. LBJ was upset by this. The poverty rate remained high, and LBJ supported substantial social programs to reduce poverty. Let me just mention a few. These included, the war on poverty included Head Start, the Job Corps, federal funds for poor neighborhood schools, community action for their own local anti-poverty policies. Johnson made food stamps permanent by law in a decade in which widespread starvation, particularly in the South, came to notice, partly through the efforts of Bobby Kennedy. In fact, Bobby Kennedy he created a documentary, I think it was on CBS, in which a child literally died of starvation on the hospital table. What a horror. Of course, in these years, LBJ expanded Medicare and Medicaid, and on it went. And the civil rights legislation was passed, which helped reduce poverty for Blacks. Now, why is America so opposed to the concession that poverty is not the fault of the poor, but created by a lack of opportunity, a lack of adequate schooling, a lack of money in infancy through, let's say, 12 years old? Why are we so hesitant? One reason, and let me say this explicitly because it upsets people. One reason I believe is pure racism. People think the poor in America are underprivileged because they're Black, that there is a Black culture of poverty that leads to laziness and shirking of work. This is documented by many surveys. This is not just some notion I have as a practicing progressive. For example, I think the most telling one is that surveys show that people believe well more than half of the poor are Black people. Far more than is the case. In fact, about 23% of the people, poor people, are Black. A far higher proportion, some 40%, are actually white. This, to me, is clear evidence that there is a bias there is a presumption that Black people will be poor, which contradicts the facts of the case. When it comes to children, they make up 1/4 of the population, but 1/3 of children are poor. 1/3 of Black children are poor, while 1/10 of white kids are poor. There's a strong case, and it's practiced not merely by Republicans, but a strong case that Democrats themselves, or Democratic writers themselves, claim that there is a Black culture that's condemning these kids to future poverty. It's just, I can't tell you what nonsense it is. It's not borne out by the facts. Are a handful of Black people like that? Yes. Are a handful of white people like that? Yes. But it's extraordinary how many well-known progressive writers have adopted the same attitude 10, 15, and 20 years ago. So there's a myth about a poverty of culture, which began with Oscar Lewis, who examined the poor cultures in South America and the Caribbean islands. This myth has been very destructive, and it stems from racism. So does the myth that welfare is the problem, not the solution, because the argument made by a handful of writers who you will remember and who wrote bestsellers, by and large, and were on the Reagan bandwagon in the 1980s. This mythology that developed because it was believed that Black people will just take that money and abuse it and waste it and not work, not develop themselves, and not develop their kids. We have so much evidence today that that's simply not the case for people who get cash allowances for their kids. I want to emphasize this point about general notions that the poor in America deserve what they get. There's a whole literature about the deserving poor. Do they deserve welfare and so forth? I am siding with cash money. I'm siding with the cash money people. And that's why I wrote this book, to promote cash allowances. Miracle of miracles, though 5 years ago, people never thought it was practical. Congress passed a child tax credit that went to all children, whether the parents made any money at all. This was a serious revolutionary breakthrough. And the immediate result, when it passed, was a sharp reduction in child poverty, a sharp reduction in the number of kids who were poor. Then Biden proposed the Bring Back Better. I always get it mixed up, but the Bring Back Better, quite respectable, and I think very valuable program that was not passed, partly because of Manchin, and the CTC has been disposed of for the time being. A lot of people, including myself, are working on getting it passed again. Let's hope it does, because guess who's suffering? Children are suffering again. We made a great breakthrough. I did not think it would be that Congress would renounce the idea, and they did. And it says something about America. Let me say something passionate about America. Our history will not be a pleasant history. It will not be a history of conscience and sensitivity to people. It will not be a history of opportunity for all, because opportunity is not created just willy-nilly. Here's an opportunity, go get it. Amartya Sen was a leader in this regard. He and some of his colleagues, including Martha Nussbaum, talked about capabilities. We've got to give young people the capability to develop themselves, get jobs, and provide for a family if they so choose. America doesn't do that with its young kids. Doesn't do that nearly as well as Western democracies do it. Child poverty, as I say, is much lower, as a result of child allowances, is much lower in countries like Germany, France, and even England, which ain't great. I'm distraught at a nation that can be so insensitive about their poor and blame parents for their poor kids, and inadvertently or advertently blame kids for being poor. Imagine that. I think what America has to do, which other countries don't have as much trouble with, although they have some, is to begin to have faith in poor people. Faith that the poor can get good jobs and do well in them. Faith that poor people can bring up their children well, nutritiously, educationally, if they have enough money. Faith in that lower 25 to 30% of America that has to be made productive if we're going to have a productive nation. And faith in those people if we're going to have a nation that future generations will look back on proudly and be reminded and be aware of how sensitive we were to the needs of all people. Opportunity for all, in my view, I don't want to say it's nonsense, but it's a silly slogan. Capabilities for all is the slogan. So I promoted this idea of a cash allowance for all kids for that very reason, for the reason that kids are in pain. They have a reduced future because they don't have enough money when they grow up. I'm looking down my list to see if there's some important points I wanted to raise, but I think I got to most of them. And there will be some time to answer questions. But let's try to understand the poor. Let's try to make them productive, because that will only contribute to our own relative prosperity over time. And let's recognize that political and racial prejudice is at the core of this maltreatment of poverty in America, this neglect of creating social programs to reduce poverty. Poverty is a scourge. Let's keep that in mind. It's the fires of our time. Let me go back to you, Brooke, and see if there are any questions, and maybe I can fill out some blank spaces that I neglected.
Great, Jeff. Are there questions here in the live audience that folks would like to ask?
Sure.
I don't see any hands at the moment. I will ask you a question, Jeff, that I had as you came to some of the last topics, because of your assessment that it's really a lot about racism. I am reminded of a book by Jonathan Metzl called Dying of Whiteness. And it's an interesting, more from the political point of view, but your analysis and his analysis are quite fascinating. And I'd love to have, at some point down the line, people who are thinking this way kind of get together, because he has interviewed people in the Midwest, largely in the South, to try to understand why people are voting against their own interests. Am I causing it back up a little?
Are you asking me a question?
No, I'm not really. I wonder, one, have you heard of that text? And two, if people wanted to do some work about speaking one, the research that you've done, that this is a racist belief, how can we all work to help reduce that and change the outcomes for kids and these parents?
Well, I would say vote for anybody who's promoting. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Work for anybody who's promoting a child tax credit in the next legislative session. There are local child tax credits. You should check in your communities to see if you can contribute, or whether there's any volunteer labor that can be done to help these kids. I would try to learn about it. Obviously, money is not the only problem these kids have. I would try to learn more about how poverty affects them. It's such a substantially difficult issue. As for the theme of the author you just mentioned, many people are wondering why Americans vote against their own interest. For example, tax huge tax cuts for the wealthy. I'm not against tax cuts for everybody, but the tax cuts we've had in the last few years are absurd. And why do we vote for people who promote them as if they will create wealth? As I just mentioned, as I mentioned early on, billionaires were created by enormous tax cuts, and that did not trickle down to the rest of the economy. The economy grew slowly. Let me add some factors to that. Business investment did not grow rapidly. Of all things that we were promised, investment in business did not grow as rapidly as it did when taxes were much higher after World War II until Ronald Reagan. So why did this happen? I think I do have some opinions about that, and I wrote about that over time. I wrote a book called The Case for Big Government, which was partly about how to increase wages. But I think men in particular got bitter about the lack of rising wages in America. And the press, the media did not fully, and I'm including the New York Times, did not fully report on this. Some thought that new economy, remember the old gun-ho new economy stuff, that all Americans were now doing well and they had new products and wages were okay, if not exploding. It was just all wrong. Americans got bitter because they could. Men got bitter because they couldn't support their families. Women got bitter. They went back to work and didn't make as much as men. And they certainly deserve to. Now they're, in fact, in some cases, making on average more than men, which I think is pretty constructive. So I think that's been a big problem and a big question mark in the minds of people who analyze and comment on economic matters. And I think part of it was due to media's neglect and blindness to these issues. They bought into the new economy. They bought into the neoliberal idea that wages would just go up if taxes were low. And there's no theoretical justification for that idea, certainly nothing to speak of. And in fact, the evidence shows it didn't work out. And I wish people, even more so sometimes in child poverty, I wish people would get clear when they're promised a tax cut, and then you get these guys, these policymakers in Washington and elsewhere, also in state capitals, claiming we cut taxes and we're going to get rapid growth. And then you look, and the cut taxes didn't result in great economies or certainly higher wages. On the issue of Mariana Mazzucato and the purpose of government, I did mention that I wrote a book called The Case for Big Government, or did I? Probably I didn't, which was, we're just not getting, we never had a prosperous economy without an active and effective government. So let's get rid of that myth also. And we're going to have poor kids unless we have an effective government who gets them the money they need to have a full future. And I have one last thing to give you, to put a little bit of evidence onto this notion. When a woman named Molly Orshansky created the first poverty rate in the 1960s, she thought it was too low. She thought poverty rate should be the level we can't live below. But at that point, in 1969, the Nixon government actually made her rate official. It was unofficial under LBJ. And it was half of median income. That was what the rate was. Half of household income. What am I saying? Not median income. Half of household income was the poverty rate. I think you mentioned the poverty, didn't you? You mentioned the poverty rate in your opening remarks.
Right. I mean, the poverty rate for an individual is like about 17,000 here. The federal level is even lower than that. It's 12,000, 12,008.
So when Molly first did this poverty rate, and Johnson's people thought it was actually too too high. It was about 50% of household income, as I just said. Now it's less than 30% of household income. What happened? We stopped caring about poverty. We stopped caring about poor people, and we wanted to save money. Johnson's poverty rate should have been higher, but he didn't want to upset Americans too much by using that money. And he also had to decided he had to fight a Vietnam War. So the poverty rate and the computation of the poverty rate, which I haven't gone into, but I do in my book, is a very complex matter, which itself is imbued with prejudice and against poor people, and maybe arguably against Black people in particular, but against poor people. Hi, I'm running out of voice. Did anybody see my voice?
There's a question, I think. Right, I think, Beth, yeah. No question? Any other questions? I don't see any online.
Does anybody know any poor? Let me tell you a little anecdote. I was talking to a very bright guy, an MIT graduate engineer, professor at NYU, an inventor of some useful products. And this was a few years ago, telling him about a book I'm just publishing. And we were talking about child poverty. And you know what the guy said? The guy said, "Are there any poor children in New York?" That's an example of the neglect of this issue. Go up 20 blocks from where we were having dinner, and you'll find plenty of poor people in New York's Harlem, or you go across the rivers to the Bronx and Brooklyn, you'll find them.
Oh my gosh, we do have 2 questions here live. So our first questioner.
Hi, I was just wondering if you think it's helpful for people to take these like poverty classes. Like we've had this here before where you spend a day like imagining what it's like to be poor, and they go through how much money you might have. It's like a little program that you go through where you're pretending to be poor. I don't know do you think that stuff is helpful?
I do think it's helpful. I think everybody in America should take one of those. People have to understand that poor people suffer. They're just not having a grand old rollicking time, not working or something, or not working much, or not doing their homework. And then there's the other issue. How can they afford fancy sneakers? You know, it's because they have that's the only thing they have that ties them to culture and they can be proud of. That's why the kids want those sneakers that much. So yeah, find out I think it's a great idea to go out just for a day. Poor for a Day. What was that? Does anybody remember that show, Queen for a Day?
You're good. There are several of us women here who do remember it, Queen for a Day.
Yeah, my mom watched that all the time, and she wanted to be that queen. That's America.
Yes. So another question.
Hi, I have a question. If we don't deal with this problem, which started 60s, 70s, and we continue, then we'll be into the 3rd and 4th generation of poor. Like my children in their late 30s were hit hard. Beginning of poverty, I think I saw a lot of it with like high school kids. Then they had children, and their children are poor, and now their children are having children. And until we stop this string of events, it's really never going to go away, is it? I mean, unless we hit it hard, we're never really going to see it turn around so that we don't have 3rd or 4th generation poor kids.
I think you raise a very important point. As I stated, the poverty issue became very clear in the 1960s, when a lot of people were at last doing well, but a large contingent weren't doing well and continued to do poorly. What happened beginning with Reagan This is another thing people may not know about Ronald Reagan. Wages adjusted for inflation, which is the way economists generally measure wages, wages fell under Ronald Reagan. You hardly heard about that, especially from the media. They fell, in fact, every year from the year before. Imagine that. And people still hail him as having managed a great economy. It's an outrage. Now, what happens when wages go down for lower income people? They get poorer. They can't afford the food they want. They can't afford treats for kids or even a warm coat. And this has only gotten worse. Low income people don't make much. You know, it's just changed in the last 2 years. Wages for very low income people at last are going up. We have to make sure they keep going up, and that will require policy. It will require a higher minimum wage. We are now beginning to get the higher minimum wage, and the minimum wage never went up. I'm using Ronald Reagan as the example, but Ronald Reagan never supported a higher minimum wage. Why are you voting for people like Ronald Reagan? Let me ask. I don't think anybody here is, but that's what I asked them. They just don't believe you. They believe the mythology. He was very good at mythology. And so we need programs to help raise wages for poor parents who can then support their children. We need higher minimum wages. We need labor laws to be enacted, not merely enacted, but they have to be, what's the word I'm looking for, Brooke? They have to be enforced. We don't enforce the labor laws anymore. We don't enforce overtime laws. We don't enforce minimum wage laws. All of this is required. All of this started to fall apart in this period that I'm talking about. And kids are the ones who suffer the most from this. I see some action there on my screen.
Well, I do have a question. I don't know that you mentioned this yet, but how much are you talking about per children? Can you get into the details a little bit?
Oh, yeah, I get into the details in the book, but I talked about $3,000 to $4,000 a year, $300 to $400 a month. I'm in the $400 a month camp, which would have been, $4,800 a year. The increase in the child tax credit was a little less than that, but that would help enormously. Now, is that a lot of money? It could cost America $100 billion, perhaps. I think I did the computations and they're in the book. I should have looked them up to remind myself. That's not really a lot of money to get kids under the over the poverty line. And so we're not talking about a lot of money here. Although the Republicans and Senator Manchin will tell you it's a lot of money. What's not a lot of money is giving benefits to coal companies. I'm being facetious in case anybody didn't get that.
Would that be only for families in poverty? Or where would the cutoff be?
It would be, my plan is to give everybody that money, and it would be taxable. So if you're pretty well off, you'll have to pay income tax on that $3,000 to $4,000 a year. If you're not well off or making no money at all, that $3,000 to $4,000 is yours.
Sounds great to me.
Okay, let's do it. Here's the problem: we already did it, and then they rescinded it.
I don't see a chat. Do you, Jeff, on your, I don't see it.
Are you talking to me?
Yeah, yes, I am. Do you, I don't see a chat. You said that.
Oh, we said actually, he saw me.
Oh, he saw you. Okay, all right, all right. Are there any other questions here that have come to mind to folks? I don't see them.
Go out and do that Poor for a Day program. I love that idea. Wow.
We have a question here live. Just a second.
So the whole poor situation, is it anything biblically based? Because in Sunday, part of the reading we did was the poor will always be with us. So is that somebody's thinking that we're, why spend money on them? They're always going to be here anyways. We've always had them.
No, I'm opposed to that idea.
Oh,
I know it's in the Bible. People keep citing it, but I don't believe the poor have to be with us. That passage was written in a time when poverty was pretty rampant. And we've reduced poverty sharply, even in all Western democracies. It's quite an achievement. But the tragedy of it is a large proportion of the population is still very poor, wondering whether they'll eat well that week. When we reduced when the child tax credit that I'm talking about was eliminated, the new level was eliminated, hunger levels went up for kids in America, the way it's measured by the agriculture department. Nice. Kids are more hungry because Senator Manchin, if you haven't read an article in the New York Times about how Senator Manchin made his money, my wife brought it to my attention. It was front page of the Times. This man is pretty shocking. And I'm sorry to pick on him, but he's picking on us. So no, I don't think the poor will necessarily always be with us, but I think it's a very dangerous thought that we don't have to do anything about them, because there's a line in the Bible written in a period of widespread poverty that the poor will always be with us. I think that line was really meant to encourage charity to the poor, but I'm not sure.
All right, I don't see any more questions. It's certainly been an informative and helpful evening, and very, I think, understandable. And, people will agree with some parts and disagree with others, and that's the way it should be. Jeff, I'm really grateful that you were able to join us here. Do appreciate, didn't start off with the terrible time you had getting back from through storms. And so that was quite something that you are here and been lively, and really thank you. And I do hope to hear more of you and from you as we go forward.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and good luck to everybody. Let's hope we get through what may be another round of COVID. Let's hope it's a minimal one.
Absolutely. And we just had a thank you from someone online. So they very much do appreciate, even if there aren't questions right at the moment. I think not enough of us have spent much time thinking about it. So our questions probably aren't there yet, but they certainly will be. And again, thanks for bringing us this information.
My pleasure. Again, thank you all, and be well.
And good night.